The Extraordinary Life of Noor Inayat Khan, a spy who defied expectations. In the shadowy world of wartime espionage, no story defies expectation quite like that of Noor Inayat Khan. The great-great-great-granddaughter of Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, who died fighting British rule in India, transformed herself from a gentle Sufi musician and children's book author into Britain's most unlikely secret weapon against Nazi Germany. Her tale reads like a work of fiction, a princess-turned-spy who sacrificed everything to transmit crucial intelligence from occupied Paris, even as the Gestapo's net tightened around her. What drove this pacifist mystic to become the first female radio operator sent into Nazi-occupied France? How did a woman who had never told a lie in her life learn to live under an assumed identity, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse with Hitler's ruthless counterintelligence forces? The answers reveal not just an extraordinary spy, but a woman whose moral compass pointed unfailingly toward freedom, even when that meant sacrificing her own. This is the story of the spy queen who fooled Hitler right up until the moment she faced her executioners at Dachau concentration camp and shouted her last act of defiance, "Liberté!" Noor Inayat Khan, the journey from pacifism to resistance. Moscow was burning when Noor Inayat Khan took her first breath. It was January 1914, and while Europe teetered on the brink of war, Hazrat Inayat Khan, an Indian Sufi mystic who had enchanted the West with his spiritual teachings, held his newborn daughter and whispered the sacred zikr into her ear. The child's mother, Ora Ray Baker, an American who had fled her wealthy New Mexico family to follow this charismatic mystic, chose the name Noor-un-Nisa, light of womanhood. Neither parent could have imagined that their daughter, born into a tradition of absolute pacifism, would one day become Winston Churchill's most valuable spy in occupied Paris. The Khan family fled Russia just ahead of the revolution, eventually settling into a house in the Paris suburb of Suresnes that Noor's father named Fazal Manzil, House of Blessing. Here, young Noor lived a life that seemed plucked from a fairy tale. In the mornings, she would sit cross-legged with her siblings, absorbing her father's teachings about the unity of all religions and the power of music to touch the divine. In the afternoons, she wandered through the family's wild garden, composing stories about princes and magical creatures that would later become her published children's books. Her father's disciples, European aristocrats, American artists, and Indian philosophers, flowed through the house in a constant stream of exotic conversations and musical performances. But this enchanted childhood shattered in 1927 when Hazrat Inayat Khan died suddenly during a visit to India. 13-year-old Noor, the eldest of 4 children, watched her mother retreat into grief and found herself thrust into the role of family guardian. She took charge of her younger siblings' education, mastered the veena, an Indian stringed instrument, and began writing for French children's magazines to help support the family. By day, she studied child psychology at the Sorbonne. By night, she crafted stories that wove together the Eastern and Western traditions that made up her cultural DNA. The rise of Hitler cast a dark shadow over Noor's creative idol. As fascism spread across Europe, she watched Jewish friends disappear from her university classes. Nazi rhetoric about racial purity struck at the heart of everything her father had taught about human unity. When she attended anti-fascist rallies in Paris, Noor struggled to reconcile her father's teachings of universal brotherhood with the growing need to take sides. Her brother Vilayat would later recall finding her in tears after reading reports of Kristallnacht, clutching her vina and saying, "Father taught us to love all equally, but how can one love those who do such things?" The summer of 1939 found Noor in England, where she'd taken her young sister Claire to improve her English. They were staying with family friend and fellow Sufi Azim Goldenberg when news came that Germany had invaded Poland. As Britain declared war, Noor faced the first great moral crisis of her life. The pacifist teachings of her father pulled her one way. The fascist threat to everything he'd stood for pulled her another. In that moment, the Princess of Sufism began her transformation into the Spy Queen of Baker Street. But first, she had to convince her family and herself that sometimes fighting for peace requires going to war. The pacifist princess turned warrior, Noor Inayat Khan's journey, 1939 to 1942. The skies over London blazed orange as Noor Khan watched her new home burn during the Blitz. From the rooftop of her family's Bloomsbury flat, she could see Nazi bombers threading through searchlight beams, their payloads transforming familiar streets into apocalyptic tableaus. This wasn't the England she'd known from children's stories of tea parties and garden mazes. This was a nation fighting for its life, and the decision forming in her mind would have scandalized her father's disciples. She would join the war effort. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force, WAIF, seemed an odd fit for a princess-turned-pacifist who had never so much as held a weapon. Yet Noor threw herself into training with the same intensity she'd once devoted to mastering the vina. Her facility with radio equipment proved remarkable. Those same delicate fingers that had once plucked spiritual melodies now tapped out Morse code at twice the speed of her fellow trainees. Her commanding officers noted not just her technical skills, but her peculiar ability to maintain calm under pressure. During one air raid, while other trainees rushed to shelters, Noor stayed at her post, continuing to relay vital messages as bombs fell nearby. It was this combination of skills that caught the attention of Britain's newly formed Special Operations Executive, SOE. Spymaster Maurice Buckmaster had a problem. His radio operators in occupied France were being caught and executed faster than he could replace them. Average survival time, 6 weeks. He needed someone extraordinary, someone who could move undetected through Paris, someone with the technical skills to evade Nazi direction-finding vans, someone with the mental fortitude to maintain their cover story, even under interrogation. In Noor's file, he found something unprecedented. A radio operator who had lived in Paris, spoke perfect French, and possessed the kind of creative intelligence that couldn't be taught in spy school. The SOE's training program at Wanborough Manor tested candidates to their breaking point and beyond. Noor learned to kill silently, to withstand interrogation, to operate in absolute darkness. Her instructor's reports painted a conflicting picture. Theoretically unsuited for this type of work, yet shows remarkable aptitude, too trusting and naive, but demonstrates unusual resourcefulness, physically delicate, but exhibits extraordinary endurance. One instructor wrote simply, "The gentlest soul I've ever trained to kill." On a rain-slicked evening in June 1943, Noor stood on a remote airfield, waiting to board the Lysander aircraft that would carry her into occupied France. Her new identity papers named her Jeanne-Marie Renier, a children's nurse. Her radio codebook was disguised as a book of French poetry. Around her neck hung a delicate silver chain with her father's ring, the only piece of her old life she would take into her new one. As she climbed aboard, the pilot asked if she was ready. Noor's response, recorded in SOE files, would prove prophetic. "I was born for this moment." In the coming months, as she played her deadly game of hide-and-seek with the Gestapo through the streets of Paris, that moment of decision would be tested again and again. But for now, as the Lysander lifted into the darkness, Noor Inayat Khan, codename Madeline, had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The pacifist princess had become a warrior, and the next chapter of her extraordinary life would be written in the shadow of the swastika. The Spy Queen, Noor Inayat Khan's resistance in Nazi-occupied Paris. The woman who stepped off the Paris metro at dawn bore little resemblance to the princess who had once lived in the city. Gone were the flowing scarves and musical instruments. Noor, now Jean-Marie, carried only a shopping bag containing a radio transmitter disguised as a recipe box. She had already changed apartments 3 times in the past week, staying one step ahead of the Nazi direction-finding vans that prowled the streets, hunting for illegal broadcasts. Her first transmission from Paris had been brief, arrived safely. Network intact. Awaiting instructions. But within weeks, Noor had become London's most valuable asset in occupied France. While other radio operators stuck to rigid schedules, she innovated broadcasting from moving trains, church bell towers, even once from the bathroom of a Nazi-frequented cafe. Her musical training proved unexpectedly vital. She could detect slight variations in radio frequencies that allowed her to identify German monitoring stations before they could locate her. The messages she transmitted to London painted a devastating picture of the German war machine, troop movements, ammunition dumps, Nazi security patterns. But it was her work with the French resistance that truly demonstrated her genius for espionage. She devised a system of dead drops using children's books in second-hand bookstores, each carefully marked page containing coded information about upcoming raids. Her handler in London would later write, "Madeline's intelligence network is providing 90% of our actionable information from the Paris region." Summer brought disaster. The Gestapo launched a massive sweep through Paris, arresting dozens of resistance members. Noor's entire network collapsed in a single week. Her fellow agents were captured one by one. London sent urgent messages ordering her to return. The last surviving radio operator in the Paris region had become too valuable to lose. But Noor refused evacuation. "My people are being arrested," she radioed back. "I am the only link left. I cannot abandon them." For 6 more weeks, she ran a one-woman resistance network. She changed her appearance daily, moved her radio between 15 different locations, and maintained the flow of intelligence to London. The strain began to show. She lost weight, slept only in short bursts, jumped at sudden noises. But her transmissions continued, providing crucial information for the planned Allied invasion. Her final message to London ended with a quote from her father's teachings, "In the darkness, become light." The next morning, at a metro station in the 10th arrondissement, a French woman noticed Noor checking her reflection in a compact mirror, their pre-arranged signal that she was being followed. The woman would later testify that Noor smiled at her, deliberately dropped her shopping bag, and walked calmly toward the exit. Inside the abandoned bag, resistance members found her radio and codebook, both completely destroyed. The Spy Queen had ensured that even in capture, she would reveal nothing to the enemy. But no one could have predicted the extraordinary act of resistance that would follow. Noor Inayat Khan, the unbreakable spirit of resistance. The Gestapo officer who interrogated Noor at 84 Avenue Foch didn't believe her cover story for a moment. A children's nurse would not have 3 sets of false identity papers, nor would she carry that much cash. Yet as hours of questioning stretched into days, he found himself frustrated by her peculiar resistance technique. She simply kept inventing elaborate new lies, each more fantastic than the last, mixing truth and fiction so seamlessly that sorting one from the other became impossible. What her captors didn't know was that Noor had turned their own prison against them. Within 3 days of her arrest, she had memorized the guard rotation schedules and discovered a loose bar in her window. On her 6th night in captivity, she squeezed through the gap and climbed down a drain pipe, disappearing into the Paris night. The Nazi pursuit was immediate and massive. For 12 hours, she led them on a chase across the city, using every rat run and secret passage she had mapped during her months as a radio operator. They caught her in Montmartre, but her second imprisonment proved even briefer than the first. This time, she convinced a maintenance worker to smuggle in a file, and once again escaped through her cell window. The Gestapo's frustration turned to rage when they discovered she had also managed to steal copies of their own surveillance reports on her activities. A third escape attempt nearly succeeded. She made it as far as the prison roof before being recaptured. Nazi counterintelligence chief Hans Kiefer took personal charge of her case, both fascinated and infuriated by this woman who seemed to treat captivity as an inconvenience rather than a death sentence. He offered her a chance to work as a double agent. Her response, recorded in his own papers, was characteristic: "I would rather die." When traditional interrogation methods failed, Kiefer tried a more insidious approach. He brought in Noor's fellow agents, now broken by torture, to identify her. She looked each one in the eye and calmly stated, "I have never seen these people before in my life." But the game was changing. The Gestapo had discovered her true identity, not just her role as a British agent, but her royal Indian heritage. Hitler himself took interest in the case. Here was a propaganda opportunity. The Muslim princess who could be turned against British imperialism. They brought in Nazi intelligence officers who specialized in Indian nationalism, hoping to exploit her father's legacy of resistance to British rule. What followed was one of the war's most extraordinary battles of wills. For 30 days, they tried to break her with a combination of philosophical arguments, appeals to anti-colonialism, and promises of power. For 30 days, she responded with quotes from her father's teachings about universal brotherhood, each one a subtle condemnation of Nazi ideology. When they finally resorted to torture, she met it with the same serene resistance that had frustrated her initial interrogators. In November 1943, Berlin sent new orders. The princess who could not be broken would be sent to Germany, where more sophisticated methods awaited. As she was led from her cell for the last time, Noor left a final message scratched into the wall, not in code, but in the clear Sanskrit she had learned at her father's knee. "Liberty is the one thing worth dying for." Noor Inayat Khan, the Princess Spy of Dachau. The winter of 1944 at Dachau concentration camp was the coldest in living memory. In the high-security bunker, kept separate from other prisoners, Noor Inayat Khan spent her days in chains, but her nights writing poems on scraps of stolen paper. The guards had learned to fear her quiet defiance, this prisoner who answered their brutality with quotes from Rumi and whose very serenity seemed an act of resistance. SS officer Wilhelm Ruppert made a special study of prisoner 457. Her file marked her as highly dangerous, yet she spent her solitary confinement teaching fellow prisoners to tap messages in Morse code through the walls. When caught, she accepted her punishment without complaint, then began again the next day. A secret report from that period noted with frustration. Despite extreme privation, subject continues to demonstrate inexplicable morale. What the Nazis labeled as inexplicable, her fellow prisoners understood perfectly. The Princess Spy had transformed her cell into a final act of spiritual warfare. On September 11, 1944, as Allied forces approached Paris, Berlin sent urgent orders to eliminate high-value prisoners. 4 women were led from their cells that night. Witnesses would later testify that Noor was badly beaten, but walked steadily to the execution ground. In the moment before the end, she shouted a single word that echoed across the camp: "Liberté!" The sound of that cry would haunt her executioners for years to come. One would later describe it as the voice of France itself. When British forces liberated Dachau 5 months later, they found something remarkable in Noor's cell. Scratched into the wall was a complete intelligence report. Names, dates, locations of Nazi installations she had observed during her transport across Europe. Her final act of espionage, hidden in plain sight, would help Allied investigators track down war criminals in the months that followed. Even in death, the Spy Queen had managed one last act of resistance. The official Nazi death certificate listed her simply as Nora Baker, British Spy. But in the streets of liberated Paris, a different story was already spreading, whispered accounts of the Indian princess who had fought fascism with both courage and compassion. A former guard testifying at the Nuremberg trials would offer perhaps the most fitting epitaph. She died like a saint, but she fought like a warrior. Churchill, upon hearing of her death, added a single handwritten note to her file: "I wish we had more like her." Legacy of Noor Inayat Khan, the Spy Queen's enduring impact. In 1949, a curious ceremony took place at Buckingham Palace. George VI, presenting Noor's George Cross to her mother, broke with protocol to speak privately with the grieving woman for over an hour. What passed between them remained private, but that same evening, the king ordered that a special exhibit be created at the Imperial War Museum, the first ever dedicated to a female SOE agent. The bronze bust that now stands in Gordon Square Gardens depicts Noor in her waif uniform, gazing toward her former London home. But it's the objects in the museum that tell the fuller story. Her forged papers and secret codes, her destroyed radio recovered from that Paris metro station, and most poignantly, her childhood Vina, its strings still set to the tuning she preferred. Each year, SOE training classes visit this collection. New recruits study her innovations in tradecraft, her techniques for evading surveillance, and her methods of maintaining cover under interrogation. But Noor's influence extends far beyond the intelligence community. In 2020, the Bank of England seriously considered her image for the £50 note. British Asian schoolchildren now perform plays about her life, while French resistance museums prominently feature her story. In an age of rising nationalism and religious tension, she has become a powerful symbol of multicultural heroism. The Sufi mystic who fought Nazis, the Indian princess who died for France, the Muslim woman who became a British agent. Perhaps the most remarkable testament to her legacy came in 2018, when Germany's Federal Intelligence Service established the Noor Inayat Khan Award for moral courage in intelligence work. The citation reads, for those who serve truth in a world of lies. She would have appreciated the irony, the spy who never wanted to deceive anyone becoming the standard bearer for ethical conduct in espionage. At the annual commemoration ceremony in Paris, representatives from 4 nations, Britain, France, India, and Germany, lay wreaths at her memorial. But the most moving tribute comes from the children who attend the nearby school. Every morning they place fresh flowers beneath her plaque and whisper "Liberté," keeping alive the final word of the princess who became a spy, the pacifist who became a warrior, the storyteller who became a legend. In her father's Sufi teachings, there is a concept called fana, the moment when the individual self dissolves into universal consciousness. In giving her life for universal freedom, Noor achieved a different kind of fana. She dissolved not into mystical oneness, but into the collective memory of all those who fight tyranny with courage, meet hatred with love, and choose light over darkness. The Spy Queen's greatest victory was not against Hitler, but against the very notion that we must choose between our varying identities. In her life, as in her death, she remained true to them all,